Good morning, everyone. It is 9:30 on a Friday. Welcome back to the Water Right Change Petition hearing for the California WaterFix project. I am Tam Doduk, and just joining us is Board Member Didi Adamo. Chair Marcus and our co-hearing officer, Marcus, is traveling to attend a funeral today, so she won't be able to join us, but she is watching the webcast, listening to the audio cast right now, and will be reviewing everything in its entirety. Also on the dais this morning, Dana Heinrich, Connie Mittenhofer, and Kyle Oceandusco. Boy, I'm having trouble talking this morning. Also assisting us today are Mr. Hunt and Mr. Long. Friday, all the faces look familiar. Does anyone need me to make the 3 general announcement? All right, if you hear an alarm, leave. Speaking to the microphone. Most importantly, do not make any noise during this hearing. Just kidding. Turn off your phone and any other noise-making devices to silent or vibrate, please. All right, with that, are there any housekeeping matters we need to address before I turn this over to Mr. Ruiz and Ms. Meserve? All right, not seeing any. Please begin. Do you have an opening statement?
No, I don't have an opening statement. This morning, Dean Reese on behalf of the SWRCB parties Group 21, and Ms. Meserve also is here on behalf of Group 19 with respect to this panel as well. We intend to present these two together. They have their own individual written rebuttal testimony. There are a couple of charts that Dr. Leinfelder Miles will get into that she consulted with Mr. Pritchard on. So in terms of cross, either one of them may be responsive to those charts. So I'll just begin first with Mr. Pritchard. Mr. Pritchard, you've testified in these proceedings before, correct?
Yes.
And you've been sworn before?
Yes, I have.
And did you prepare rebuttal testimony on behalf of the SWRCB parties in this matter?
Yes.
And is SWRCB 262 a true and correct copy of that testimony?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Dr. Leinfelder Miles, you've been sworn before in these proceedings, correct?
Yes, I have.
And did you prepare rebuttal testimony?
Yes.
And is SWRCB 263 a true and correct copy of that rebuttal testimony?
Yes, it is.
Okay. I'd like to begin with Mr. Pritchard. Mr. Pritchard, at this point, could you please summarize your rebuttal testimony?
Yes, I prepared this testimony in response to the rebuttal testimony of Dr. Kimmelschuh and Dr. Thornburg. I have 7 points to discuss today. That is one less than is contained in my testimony, and Dr. Michael will be addressing that comment as it pertains to Dr. Thornburg's material. Point 1, Dr. Kimmelschuh's rebuttal testimony attempted to respond to by my case-in-chief testimony as well as that of Dr. Leinfelder Miles. One of Dr. Kimmelschuh's criticism of Dr. Leinfelder Miles' leaching study was that he could not determine if the salinity of the soil was the result of only salts in the applied water or also from those contained in groundwater or some other source. This perceived lack of data led Dr. Kimmelschuh to conclude that the leaching fractions calculated by Dr. Leinfelder Miles were inaccurate. In support of his conclusions, Dr. Kimmelschuh referenced the Hoffman report, which calculated much higher leaching fractions than in the Leinfelder Miles report. Dr. Kimmelschuh was apparently unfamiliar with the Hoffman report and gave it credence, although it suffered from a more egregious error than that he accused of Dr. Leinfelder Miles of doing. In the Hoffman report, Dr. Hoffman clearly used an assumed applied water salinity instead of the actual water salinity of the applied water in the area. This necessarily means that his calculations for leaching fractions are at best a guess and only reliable if actual applied water quality reflects the quality that was assumed. Dr. Hoffman could easily have located data on water quality in the channels from which the diversions occurred, but he chose not to do that. However, the greater error was done by Dr. Hoffman, and one of which Dr. Kimmelschuh accuses Dr. Leinfelder-Miles of doing, is using the incorrect drainage salinity. Dr. Hoffman used tile drainage data, which was from many years before he wrote his report, as the effluent EC data for the drainage water. This approach might be useful if the tile drainage water was as a result of only the excess water applied or the drainage water from that field. However, the tile drain data used by Dr. Hoffman came from drains that were 8 to 9 feet deep, mostly intercepting groundwater of unknown origins. And this is via a personal communication with Jack Alvarez, which is the director of the West Side Irrigation District, who farms in that area. The degree to which any of these drains are collecting excess applied water, therefore, is unknown. The sworn testimony from Jack Alvarez, who farms in that area, about those tile drains confirms that those drains mostly collect groundwater in the area and are not explicitly the excess water applied to any great degree, and that is in his declaration submitted in the Bay Delta process. Obviously then, Dr. Hoffman used an assumed applied water EC and incorrectly used the drain water as an indication of the drainage water EC in his leaching fractions. And basically it's simply an exercise in math and bear no relationship to what actually occurred on the lands from which the data was derived in the South Delta lands. It is clear, however, that Dr. Kimmelschuh's reliance on the Hoffman report as an indicator that the Leinfelder-Miles leaching fractions are incorrect is unsupportable. Dr. Hoffman's leaching fraction calculation cannot be used as a scientific basis for determining leaching fractions in the Southern Delta. His data are simply wrong and unusable. I will also note that the locations of the tile drains referenced by Dr. Hoffman are virtually all located in the very southern or the southwestern areas of the Southern Delta. Those areas have a much deeper groundwater table and do not, for the most part, receive water from the areas of the poor quality in the Southern Delta channels and do not experience salt impacts to the degree that these other areas do. In sum, not only did Dr. Hoffman use the incorrect data, he also focused on areas in which were less prone to salt damage. My second point is also directed at Dr. Kimmelschuh's materials. As previously recognized in cross-examination and redirect, my calculations of the crop yield reductions were incorrect due to my mistaken use of the salinity of the irrigation water instead of the salinity of the soil that results in zero yield of each of the crops presented. These soil EC values were used to calculate the rate of decline per unit of soil salinity in the relative yield equation. The net effect was a correct determination of when yields begin to decline at a specific irrigation water quality and leaching fraction. But they overestimate the rate of decline after the threshold. In Dr. Kimmelschuh's rebuttal testimony, he attempted to produce a corrected version of the yield reduction calculations, but also made an error by using the wrong yield reduction numbers in 2 of his 3 charts. The result was to also underestimate the yield reduction per unit soil salinity, having no impact on the threshold. Obviously, we each made simple mistakes, which I am now correcting, and an updated figure 4 from my original testimony on page 11 is on page 5 of my rebuttal testimony. Could we bring up that page 5?
Going to be SDWA 262, page 5.
That's fine. That's the one I want to focus on right there. Thank you. This table corrects my error and that of Dr. Kimmelshue's. Since the numbers are different, I think it is helpful for us to explain them once again. Under the 5% leaching fraction scenario that we see on the top of our screen in the top chart, and recall that Dr. Leinfelder-Miles' study found some leaching fractions below that 5%, we exceed the crop tolerance threshold and yield reductions begin to occur at a specific water EC. Those are highlighted in the pinkish color there. And those are a water EC of, for the first column, for bean is 0.4, 0.6 for corn, 0.7 for alfalfa, 0.8 for tomato, 0.5 for almond, and also for grape. It's important to note that the point at which the decreased yields occur does not change from the original incorrect charts, and either from my charts or Dr. Kimmelshue's. Rather, the rate at which the crop yields decrease were affected. The underlying point being that the damages to crop yields occur when the EC of the applied water, taking from the southern delta channels, increases past the threshold. Dr. Kimmelshue is incorrect when he dismisses such damages. Point number 4. Dr. Kimmelshue makes the point in his rebuttal testimony that I and Dr. Leinfelder-Miles are emphasizing study and modeling results to show adverse impacts while not taking into account times in which there were no expected impacts. This misses the point of analysis being done by both petitioners and protestants. It's my understanding that the purpose of the hearings is to determine if the proposed project will injure other legal users of water. To determine if such injury occurs, one must examine those conditions and circumstances under which injury might or is expected to occur. To also look at any potential benefits derived from the proposed project is not, to my knowledge, a criterion by which the board evaluates these adverse effects. If, for example, a project causes no harm in 1 year, but 2 years later, for example, if a project causes harm in 1 year, but 2 years later somehow causes no harm or in fact a benefit, the fact is there was a benefit does not in any manner undo the previous harm. Thus, the notion of offsetting benefits with injury is in fact an attempt to average away impacts on third parties. Dr. Kimmelshue's suggestion that is more appropriate to look at averages, as done in the Hoffman report also I must point out, is unrealistic when applied to farmers who are supposed to be protected against injury when the board grants a permit for change in the point of diversion. Point number 5, Dr. Kimmelshue concludes that crop production has not been impacted by current irrigation water salinity levels and will not be impacted by anticipated future salinity levels. There are 2 errors contained in his conclusion. The first, that it ignores the testimony of other South Delta Water Agency farmer witnesses who unanimously stated under the current conditions they were either experiencing crop damage or due to salts, or were undertaking additional management practices to prevent or lessen current salt damage. There's no basis for the reliance on the Hoffman report's calculated conclusion that no harm when people actually are being harmed, have presented testimony and evidence that they are indeed being harmed. Excuse me for confusing that a little bit. The second error in Dr. Kimmelshue's conclusion is that the Hoffman report assumed a water quality of 0.7 EC. Once again, the record in this case provides us with facts instead of Dr. Hoffman's assumptions. South Delta Water Agency exhibits 18, 19, and 35 show data of measured water quality in certain South Delta locations. As can clearly be seen in these, the channel water quality is often worse than the 0.7 during the irrigation season. The point being that Dr. Hoffman's calculations are based on the EC of 0.7, while the actual water quality is sometimes worse. Thus, one cannot rely on the Hoffman's conclusions about the existing or future harm, as Dr. Kimmelshoe did, because the calculations are not connected to reality. Point number 6, Dr. Kimmelshoe criticizes my explanation of how model inputs can be modified to better reflect actual in-field conditions by comparing it to a later comment by me that differences between model runs should not be understood to indicate what conditions will actually result. His criticism has no basis. My testimony includes a reference as to how models can and are adjusted to better reflect actual conditions when one is trying to analyze some specific set of conditions. My later comment that model run differences should not be considered to reflect actual conditions is simply a truism regarding channel water quality modeling, and in no way contradicts my other observation about how modelers adjust inputs to get better outputs. Of course, models like the one used to calculate soil salinities or leaching fractions are only calculations which produce results from a set of inputs and cannot ever be thought of as ironclad predictors of what's going to happen in the real world. However, we use models to try to understand how conditions might change because we simply can't do multi-year studies for thousands of acres every time we want to analyze how some change of condition might affect soil salinity, crop production, etc. The point is that although we use models to help us understand what might happen when certain conditions change, they're not expected to be precisely accurate. In this case, Dr. Kimmelshoe criticizes my description of how models work, their reliability, while at the same time choosing to rely on model runs in the Hoffman report instead of relying on an actual survey of the area. He can't have it both ways, especially when an examination of the Hoffman report indicates it's undoubtedly unreliable in this respect. Point number 7. Dr. Leinfelder-Miles is addressing numerous issues in her rebuttal testimony, including the reliability of her data and conclusion. I'd like to comment on one of those issues as it directly relates to my previous comments. Dr. Kimmelshoe believes it's more appropriate to rely on the Hoffman report calculations than to rely on the work of Dr. Leinfelder-Miles. It is true that Dr. Leinfelder-Miles' study was done over a relatively short period of time and in dry conditions. However, that is no scientific basis for discounting the study and preferring calculations based on faulty numbers. The Leinfelder-Miles alfalfa study is an accurate, sound, and reliable study which showed how then existing conditions included very poor leaching fraction of soils, the buildup of salts in the soil, and the potential for decrease in crop production when certain local crop salinity thresholds are exceeded. The data indicates that in certain areas, salinity buildup in the soil is a real threat to crop production. The Leinfelder-Miles study is a strong evidence that any adverse change in applied water salinity resulting from the proposed project will likely adversely affect Southern Delta crop production. When this evidence is compared to the lack of evidence provided by DWR on the potential impacts to the Southern Delta farmers, it appears that only one conclusion can be made. Dr. Kimmelshoe's criticisms notwithstanding, the conclusion is that the petitioners have not shown what will happen to the Southern Delta crop production if the project is undertaken, and that South Delta Water Agency et al. Have shown the likelihood of damage. For my last point, number 8, Dr. Kimmelshoe criticized my assertion that on-site conditions can limit the ability of applied water to move through the soil profile and remove excess salts. He further states if this were actually true, salinization of the ground would have already occurred and no agricultural production would be taking place. Therefore, the leaching fraction must be of some significance to continue to allow for crop production to continue to occur. These comments were made in reference to alfalfa culture and the leaching study conducted by Dr. Michelle Leinfelder-Miles. The study clearly shows low leaching fractions exist in the Delta in alfalfa culture. In making this statement, Dr. Kimmelshoe obviously does not consider the long-term effects of crop rotations to crops in which higher leaching fractions can be achieved, rainfall variability, and other grower practices that might reduce salt buildup when making these comments. Thank you. That concludes my comments.
Dr. Leinfelder-Miles, will you please summarize your rebuttal testimony at this point?
Yes, could we please bring up SDWA 263? I'll be referring to it later on in my presentation. My name is Michelle Leinfelder-Miles, and I'm the Delta Crops Resource Management Advisor with UC Cooperative Extension, based in San Joaquin County. I've prepared this rebuttal testimony in response to the rebuttal testimony of Dr. Joel Kimmelshoe. Specifically, I will address his opinions on peer review, experimental methodology, sources of salinity in agricultural systems, precipitation and leaching, and alfalfa variety salinity tolerance. On the matter of peer review, Dr. Kimmelshoe has been critical of my testimony because I rely on my project work, which has not yet been peer reviewed. However, when asked about the Hoffman Report, or DWR 580, he said that review by academic peers is a form of peer review. Dr. Kimmelshoe's statements obscure the meaning of peer review and apply different standards to Hoffman's work and my own. It is my intention to have my work published in a refereed journal. It is not typical for a scientist to release drafts of a manuscript, but I have done so for this hearing because the data are relevant to this discussion, particularly as the petitioners have not provided any data on the matter of soil salinity in Delta agricultural systems. Rather, the petitioners have relied on the Hoffman Report. I'd like to point out that I too reference Hoffman in my work, as it contains a comprehensive literature review and contextualizes the literature for the South Delta. I, however, disagree with Hoffman's assumptions on water quality and leaching fractions, and hence conducted a study to measure applied water and soil salinity and calculate the leaching fractions using these data. On experimental methodology, Dr. Kimmelshoe was critical of the following: sampling site locations, repeatability, and one-time versus multi-year sampling. On the matter of specifying sampling sites, as it relates to the scientific review of a work, the time and place cannot be repeated exactly, and thus naming the specific location is unnecessary. On the matter of repeatability, it is the methodology that must be repeatable, not the conclusions. I have provided clear description of my methods, which would allow others to repeat what I have done. Finally, on the matter of my one-time sampling on Ryer Island, I agree with Dr. Kimmelshoe that I cannot speak on trends or changes over time, but I disagree that a one-time sampling somehow renders the data invalid. The data from the Ryer Island study accurately characterizes soil salinity conditions in the vineyard and pear orchard at the end of water year 2015-16. In cross-examination, Dr. Kimmelshoe was asked what other sources of salinity may impact crops besides salinity from applied irrigation water, and he provided the following sources: rainfall, soil mineral weathering, and brackish shallow groundwater. First, rainfall. In my review of scientific literature, I have not found any references that describe rainfall as a source of salinity. And the Hoffman Report describes how rainfall mediates soil salinity. Thus, we can dismiss rainfall as a source of salinity in the Delta. Second, mineral weathering. Previous research indicates that mineral weathering may be a source of salinity when the irrigation water's salt content is low and when the leaching fraction is high. In my field work, I have not found such conditions and thus contend that mineral weathering is not substantially contributing to soil salinity conditions in the delta. Hoffman came to the same conclusion. Finally, regarding shallow groundwater, I agree with Dr. Kimmelshoe that this point needs addressing. However, I disagree that the depth of groundwater in the delta invalidates the use of a leaching fraction equation that relates applied water salinity and soil salinity. To support this argument, Dr. Kimmelshoe misquoted the Ayers and Westcott text and referenced a manuscript that determined a leaching requirement, not a leaching fraction, even after Dr. Kimmelshoe emphasized the importance of distinguishing these two terms. For these reasons, Dr. Kimmelshoe has failed to support his argument that shallow groundwater invalidates using the leaching fraction equation that compares applied water salinity and soil salinity. Furthermore, I disagree with Dr. Kimmelshoe's suggestion that groundwater salinity contributed to root zone soil salinity at my study sites, or that salts in the groundwater are coming from a source other than applied water. The literature is far from absolute on when groundwater may contribute to soil salinity and when it may not. Ayers and Westcott describe a safe depth of 2 meters. However, Hoffman described it as 3 feet. In the Alfalfa project, I never measured groundwater shallower than 1 meter, or about 3.3 feet. For reasons described in my written testimony, the soil salinity profiles I observed in my work are as I would expect them to be for applied water via a flood irrigated system. On precipitation and leaching, I agree with Dr. Kimmelshoe that the effect of precipitation on leaching should be addressed. And this has always been an explicit objective of my alfalfa leaching fraction study. I have now calculated leaching fractions taking precipitation into account, and these are presented in Table 1. If we could please bring up Table 1.
Do you have a page number?
It's Exhibit B at the very end, toward the end. Before the figures are all the tables. There we go, Table 1. Factoring in precipitation results in a lower applied water EC and a lower leaching fraction. This is because the leaching fraction equation calculates the leaching fraction as the EC of the applied water divided by the EC of the soil. Rainwater lowers the EC of the applied water, but the measured soil salinity does not change in the equation. Therefore, we calculate a lower leaching fraction. We can visualize why precipitation is not contributing more to leaching by observing the daily water balance of the soil and the change in soil moisture from field capacity for the 7 alfalfa sites. I'm going to be going through figures 1 through 4 now in Exhibit C. We'll start with Figure 1. Figure 1 shows the daily water balance for water year 2012-13, a year when we received approximately 8.8 inches of rain. This figure shows a close-up view of precipitation minus the ET for alfalfa, which I will call ETC. When the blue line peaked above 0 on the y-axis, rainfall exceeded crop water use on that day, and water stored in the soil was stored in the soil profile. Let me be clear that when rainfall exceeds ETC, that excess water is not necessarily available for leaching. First, the soil profile will absorb some of the water until it reaches a state called field capacity. We can think of field capacity as a deficit in soil moisture that must be overcome before leaching can occur. Now let's look at Figure 2. This figure represents water year 2013-14, a year when we received approximately 8.2 inches of rain. This is a year for which we have soil moisture data from the alfalfa project for the fall and can consider the soil moisture deficit that needed to be overcome to achieve leaching. In this water year, precipitation rarely exceeded ETC. That is the blue line at the top, right around 0 on the y-axis. Precipitation rarely exceeded ETC, and it was never high enough to fill the soil profiles, exceed the soil's field capacity, and leach salts. Thus, in water year 2013-14, no leaching occurred from rainfall. Moving to figure 3, this graph represents water year 2014-15, a year when we received approximately 11.8 inches of rain. As a point of comparison, data reported by Hoffman for the years 1952 to 2008 had average rainfall at 10.9 inches. In this rainfall season, there was a period starting on December 11th where soil moisture exceeded field capacity for all sites except Site 5, which is in orange. Soil moisture peaked on December 20th. The amount of soil moisture in excess of field capacity, or the difference between the peak and 0 on the y-axis, would be the water available for leaching. For the 7 alfalfa sites, this ranged from 0 inches at Site 5, because the soil at Site 5 never had soil moisture that exceeded field capacity, to 3.1 inches at Site 2, which I believe is green on that graph. As this water was available for leaching, we assumed that this water drained from the soil profile, and the lines dropped to 0 on the y-axis, or field capacity. After December 20th, the daily water balance was never enough to exceed field capacity, so no other rainfall was available for leaching over the remainder of the year. To understand how this rainfall contribution could impact soil salinity, let's now look at Table 2. Going down to Exhibit C, Table 2. Oh, sorry, up. Table 2 represents the depth of leaching water that would be required to bring the average root zone salinity of the 7 alfalfa sites to the alfalfa crop tolerance threshold of 2.0 decisiemens per meter. This table includes project data for initial average root zone salinity and soil moisture. The column labeled DW shows the amount of rainfall that would be required to leach these particular soils of salts to attain an average root zone salinity of 2.0. We see that with the exception of Site 3, where average root zone salinity was already below the threshold, the minimum amount of rainfall to bring any of the other 6 sites to the threshold would be 4.5 inches for Site 7. To reiterate, the range of rainfall available for leaching during this water year was 0 to 3.1 inches. These values illustrate that while there was rainfall available for leaching during the 2014-15 water year, the amounts were far less than what would be needed to bring the average root zone salinity of these soils to the alfalfa crop tolerance threshold. Finally, while Dr. Kimmelshoe speculated that we would see very different soil salinity after the rains we have received this year, we can actually model this with available data, and that is what Figure 4 represents. If we could go to Figure 4, please. Exhibit C, yeah. Up until June 6th of this year, we received approximately 18.5 inches of rain. I used the smallest soil moisture deficit for each of the 7 sites across the 2013 and 14 fall seasons to provide a best case scenario for leaching. Peak moisture was reached on February 21st and ranged from 2.3 inches for Site 5 to 6.4 inches for Site 7. Again, as this water was in exceedance of filling the soil profiles and thus available for leaching, we assumed that this water drained from the profiles and the lines dropped to 0. After February 21st, rainfall was never enough to fulfill ETC and fill the soil's profiles. so no other rainwater was available for leaching. Now, if we look at Table 3, using the most recent soil salinity data available from the Alfalfa Project, which was from spring 2015, and the depth of water available for leaching, again, ranging from 2.3 to 6.4 inches, we can calculate the average root zone salinity we might be able to expect after a rainfall season like we just had. Notice these soil salinities are much lower, as Dr. Kimmelshoe speculated they would be. However, 4 of the 7 sites still have an average root zone salinity that exceeds the crop tolerance threshold of 2.0 for alfalfa. What this means is that one heavy rainfall year will not eliminate our salinity concerns for Delta agricultural systems. I have 1 more minute, 1.5. Finally, Dr. Kimmelshoe expressed some other opinions about my project work, which I addressed in my written testimony. Of those, I will point out that Dr. Kimmelshoe has emphasized the importance of salt-tolerant alfalfa varieties, but he cited only one research report. In that work, the researchers only tested non-dormant alfalfa varieties, which are appropriate for hotter climates like the southern San Joaquin Valley, the Imperial Valley in Arizona, but are not appropriate for the Delta. For that project, they reported irrigation water salinity at 6.5 decisiemens per meter, but their last soil sampling for the season was in June, well before the end of the growing season, and they only sampled soil down to 12 inches. This study gives us insights into the genetic potential for alfalfa varieties, but it falls short of collecting enough data to make any conclusions about the overall salt tolerance of the plant species on a whole. In conclusion, my experiences evaluating Delta agricultural systems have given me an understanding of soil salinity and how water quality impacts the soil. I have presented data that is pertinent to this discussion, and the petitioners have not provided any data to the contrary. Thank you.
These witnesses are now available for cross-examination.
All right, Department of Water Resources.
Good morning, Trip Mizell and Robin McGinnis appearing on behalf of the Department of Water Resources. I will begin with some quick questions for Mr. Pritchard, and then Ms. McGinnis will ask questions of Dr. Leinfelder-Miles. I expect my questions to only go about 5 minutes, and they will focus on the critique of the Hoffman study. So Mr. Hunt, if we could bring up SDWA 262. I believe it's page 3. I'm looking at lines 3 through 9. So, Mr. Pritchard, I believe it's your written testimony, and then you confirmed in your verbal testimony this morning that you criticized the Hoffman 2010 report for being based upon tile drain data. Is that correct?
Yes.
Isn't it true that the Hoffman 2010 report also relied upon Meyer et al. From 1976, which was based upon actual measured data in the Southern Delta?
He does make reference to that non-peer-reviewed study.
And isn't it true that Myers et al. 1976 found a range of leaching fractions from their measured data that were between 5 and 15%, with the majority of the leaching fractions falling over 15%?
Yes, that's true.
Thank you. That concludes my questions for Mr. Pritchard.
Good morning, Dr. Leinfelder-Miles. In your peer review section of your rebuttal testimony, you referred to SDWA 139, SDWA 140, and Land 79 as versions of a manuscript, reports, and a study, correct?
Yes, they're my written work.
So I'm trying to figure out how to refer to them, the different versions.
They're different versions of the same report in which I updated references to scientific literature but did not change any of the data from one report to the next.
Okay, so then is Land 79 the current version so that you would consider SDWA 139 and SDWA 140 to be superseded?
Not necessarily. I stated in my rebuttal testimony that the manuscript is still under development, and I'll be making changes to the manuscript until it goes to publication.
So the manuscript is a document that you'll submit later, is that right?
Yes.
And these are, sorry, you call them versions of?
Versions of the project report.
Versions of the report. So on pages 11 to 15 of your rebuttal testimony, you provide an analysis of the effect of precipitation on leaching fraction. Is this analysis in any of the earlier reports?
No, it is not. It's data that I worked specifically for the rebuttal, but it was data that I was planning to get worked on for the manuscript eventually.
So you testify that it is not typical for a scientist to release drafts of a manuscript, right?
Yes.
Is that because it may be incomplete?
It's because a scientist is generally updating a manuscript until and even after it has been reviewed by peers.
Sort of like environmental documents, huh?
I'm not going to speak on environmental documents.
So will you publish all versions of the report?
No, I will publish one manuscript on this project.
So why then are those previous versions not superseded?
Because I may be going back and reviewing things that I've stated in previous versions. It's my work. I can write the final manuscript as I deem the best manuscript to be.
So SDWA 139, which I believe was dated December 2014, you would consider that to be current as of that time?
That was the project report update to that time.
Okay, and the same thing for SDWA 140, which I believe was August 2016, and the same for Land 79, which I believe was December 2016.
That was how I brought the report together for that time.
Okay. And that may be because your research is ongoing.
The project is not ongoing. The field work of that project has concluded, but I'm still analyzing the data and writing it up.
So do you expect when the manuscript is peer-reviewed, it will look exactly how it looks today?
No, I do not expect it to look exactly how it looks today.
So would the peer review include review of all three of those versions or just the current one? Or just the most recent one?
The peer review will probably be of a manuscript that is neither SDWA 139, SDWA 140, or Land 79. It will probably be a newer version.
The future version of that one document?
Correct.
Okay. So you said that you're still analyzing the data, right?
I was still analyzing precipitation data, and I've presented that in my rebuttal testimony.
And you stated you're just updating references.
I include references as I read them. I'm continually reading about salinity, And as I find papers that are relevant to the project, then I include them in the project report.
So you're going to add analysis, not just references in the future, is that correct?
I will add to the discussion of the paper.
So I'll ask again, are you going to add analysis? Or
I don't
just
know what you mean
references?
by analysis.
For example, the precipitation and leaching section in your SWR rebuttal testimony, pages 11 to 15, would you consider that analysis?
Yes, I analyze data for that section of the SWR rebuttal testimony.
Is that something you'll later add to the manuscript?
Yes, probably so.
So you will add analysis to the manuscript before you submit it for peer review?
Yes.
Okay. So isn't it true that in Land 79, you added an entire section related to depths to root zones?
No. There is no new data in Land 79 compared to SDWA 140 and SDWA 139.
So no new data, but what about analysis of depths to root zones?
When I hear the word analysis, I think of data. I think of analyzing data. Did I add discussion on some of that data? Yes, I did add discussion on that data, on the results as it related to new scientific literature that I became aware of and read about.
So you earlier testified that the data underlying the 3 reports that have been submitted as exhibits so far haven't changed.
That is correct.
But the analysis is currently, or it has been updated and it will be updated in the future.
The discussion of the paper has changed, and I will add data based on precipitation in a future version.
So in future versions, you'll add data, you'll add analysis, and you'll add references.
Yes.
So since you'll be adding data, analysis, and references, should the hearing officers disregard the previous drafts of your report?
I was going to object. It calls for speculation as to what the hearing officers should or should not do. It's irrelevant either.
Sustain.
Are you currently working on updating the manuscript?
I am continually working on updating the manuscript.
Even though there's no objection, asked and answered multiple times.
You previously testified you have the location of the study sites and sampling sites for the alfalfa study, correct?
Yes.
And you testified just now that you will be publishing this study, correct?
Yes.
So when you submit the alfalfa study for publication, will you include a map with the location of the monitoring and study sites?
Not of the specific sampling locations, no. And I've stated in my SWR rebuttal testimony that for the scientific review of this work, because the location and the time, for that matter, cannot be repeated exactly by another scientist, it is unnecessary to provide those.
I understood your testimony earlier that not providing the locations is sufficient for scientific review, but we have a different standard here, and we need to understand the foundation for your opinions. So since many variables in your work are location specific, I can't assess your work without knowing the locations.
Is there a question in
Yeah,
there?
let me objection. Is there that's a narrative? I'd move to strike the question or the narrative, and there's no question pending that I can determine.
I will view it as background leading up to a question, I hope.
How would you suggest I assess your work without knowing the locations?
In what way do you want to assess my work?
To understand the basis for your conclusions.
I don't understand what you mean by the basis for my conclusions.
We'd like the raw data that supports your conclusions.
That's not a
Just
question.
hold on, is it objection? That's not a question, it's a statement.
Sustained. Question.
So where can we access the raw data that supports your conclusions?
The raw data is not publicly available. The project is mine. Until I publish the paper, allowing public access of my data could allow another scientist to come in and publish the paper before me. It is not typical for a scientist to release data before a manuscript is published.
So, hearing officer, DWR believes the studies that's, set forth the leaching fractions for these 7 locations in the South Delta, that we need to understand the basis for the conclusions there, and that the location of the sampling sites and study sites are critical to understand the data. So, already in this hearing, raw data has been provided, even after DWR provided charts that showed the data. So I'd like to request under Government Code 11450.10A that a subpoena be issued for producing the locations.
Ms. Meserve, Mr. Ruiz?
If they want to request it, then they would need to describe why it's necessary. She said she would like to review the data. I don't really think that's what we're talking about. Our witness is available for questioning, and she's been questioned many times by you and tested by your expert as well in the opposing testimony. So I believe Dr. Leinfelder-Miles has concerns about the proprietary nature of the data because of the fact that she's seeking publication. It may be something that I think we're interested in being responsive in terms of making sure that the hearing officers have the information they need to assess the data. But in terms of this request, it's really not clear why the data that DWR is apparently seeking would be any different than what a peer review and the type of standards, the scientific standards that Dr. Leinfelder-Miles has been talking about. Why there would be some different standard that would be applicable here is beyond me.
Mr. Mizell?
I'd like to point out that this is applying a much different and higher standard to the request for data than was applied for Mr. Lehi and the data behind his exhibits. Mr. Lehi was also available for questioning and was questioned thoroughly, and yet at the same time, there was this overwhelming need by Ms. Spalletta to have the raw data in that circumstance. What we are looking at here is a study based upon specific locations in the data. We have also seen or heard and read testimony from many parties about how locations in the Delta are very particular to one another and not uniform, that soil types vary throughout the Delta, and therefore the locations are very important in assessing what the calculations were that went on behind this study. Regardless of whether they are proprietary, the study itself was produced for this hearing and was intended to be relied upon, which means the data need to be investigated.
Ms. Meserve, Mr. Ruiz?
I think that if DWR thinks they can put together a subpoena, then they should subpoena it and we will assess it and review it. At this moment, I don't think we're able to make a decision one way or the other. I need to discuss with Dr. Leinfelder-Miles.
Actually, thank you, because my counsel just reminded me that we don't issue subpoenas, parties do. Mr. Keeling, your input?
Yes. For clarification, I understand that the previous examples Mr. Mizell referred to were not scientific publications in process, as this one is. And my question would be whether the request to obtain the data, part of that is an offer to make it subject to a protective order of some sort that assures confidentiality and non-disclosure. And I'm not suggesting that even if it were, that would be acceptable, because I don't represent this witness in this panel, but I wonder if the offer included that.
Mr. Mizell, Ms. McGinnis, I suggest you give it some thought, and if you still feel inclined to request this data, to issue the subpoena, and we will take it from there.
Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Leinfelder-Miles, you say that rainfall is not substantially contributing to leaching during low rainfall years, correct?
Yes.
Isn't it true that in normal and wet years, rainfall can contribute to leaching?
I don't believe I showed that at all in the figures that I presented.
But in your opinion, as an expert, is it true that in normal and wet years, rainfall can contribute to leaching?
I'm just going to object. The question is vague and overbroad. And are you referring to her study or just in general location anywhere at any time? Or what specifically are you referring to?
Well, since I don't know the locations, I guess I am referring to any location at any time. So I'll move on.
Okay, then I'll object as overbroad and vague.
Oh, okay. So in your testimony, you say that after the 2016 through June 2017 time period, there was a notable reduction in salinity, correct?
I modeled that there could be a reduction in salinity in the soil.
That there could be, or that there would be?
I modeled it, so as Mr. Pritchard has talked about modeling, there could be a reduction in the soil salinity.
And in your testimony, I quote page 15, lines 15 to 16, this is a notable reduction in salinity, correct?
What I modeled was a notable reduction in salinity.
Okay, thank you. I can have a minute just to gather my thoughts. Okay. Then that's all. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Any redirect?
If you could just give us a minute
Actually,
to...
let me make sure. No other cross-examination. All right.
If you could just give us a minute to confer to see if we need to take up
All right.
your time with any redirect.
As you're doing that, you can multitask, right? Mr. Mizell, please come back up, because your cross-examination of Dr. Leinfelder-Miles reminded me that you were supposed to give us an update today with respect to the status of the various environmental documents.
Certainly. The update I received is that the environmental documents should receive certification within the next 2 weeks.
Oh, BIOP?
The BIOP, we will receive the BIOPs also within the next 2 weeks, but before the certification takes place.
Thank you very much.
I just have one question on redirect for Dr. Leinfelder-Miles. In your study, in your server rebuttal testimony, you do discuss some findings regarding the effect of rainfall, and you do say that it can reduce salinity potentially, correct?
Yes, I modeled that it could reduce the soil salinity. However, I showed that 4 out of the 7 alfalfa sites would still have a salinity that's higher than the crop tolerance threshold.
In your experience, can a farmer depend on any particular amount of rainfall falling to reduce salinity in crop years?
A farmer cannot predict the weather.
No further question.
No, we have no further redirect.
All right. Any recross? All right. Thank you. How are you doing, Candace? Do we need to take a short break? You're good? All right. So let's bring up Dr. Michael, I believe it is. Please begin.
Thank you. Dean Reese again on behalf of the SDWA Parties Group 21. Mr. Michael or Dr. Michael, have you previously been sworn in this matter?
Yes, I have.
And you previously submitted testimony in this matter, correct?
Yes, I did.
And did you prepare rebuttal testimony as part of your work in this matter?
Yes, I did.
And is STWA 264 a true and correct copy of your joint rebuttal testimony?
Yes.
And that's submitted on behalf of Group 21 as well as the county protestants, correct?
Correct.
At this time, Dr. Michael, can you please summarize your rebuttal testimony?
Sure, and I'll note that the testimony is SDWA 264, and I'm going to refer to a table in it. And it rebuts Dr. Thornburg's testimony in DWR 84, and I will pull up one table from that as well, so it can be for efficiency. Great. So my name is Dr. Jeffrey Michael. I'm an executive director and a professor at the Center for Business and Policy Research at the University of Pacific. Economic and policy issues in the Delta have been a major focus of my research and the center's work since I came to Pacific in 2008, 9 years ago. That's both because of its importance to the regional economy, as well as its fit with my own educational and research background, which includes agricultural and resource economics, economic development, and my dissertation, which looked at the economics of the Endangered Species Act. My Delta research experience includes being principal investigator of the Delta Protection Commission's Economic Sustainability Plan in 2011 and 2012, as well as benefit cost studies of the BDCP tunnels in 2012 and the WaterFix in 2016, which are the only economic analysis of the tunnels that are consistent with the project as described in the EIR and this petition. This rebuttal testimony responds to the rebuttal testimony of Dr. Christopher Thornburg, DWR 84. In general, I find Dr. Thornburg's testimony shows unfamiliarity with Delta agriculture and available data. He uses an invalid approach to his empirical analysis, and he misrepresents my testimony in multiple instances. My comments summarize 5 key issues. The first is just a review of basic information and concepts about Delta farming. The second is discussion of the crop choice model utilized by me and Dr. David Sunding in reports for the Delta Protection Commission and the Department of Water Resources. Third point is Dr. Thornburg's county-wide empirical yield model. The fourth is the Delta-specific theoretical yield model that's in my testimony. And lastly, a few comments on Delta levies and non-agricultural economic impacts. So let's start with what's grown, basic information. Dr. Thornburg's analysis is mostly based on aggregate countywide data from the San Joaquin County Crop Report, and he uses this to make inferences about the Delta. This only makes sense if the Delta is a large share of San Joaquin County and Delta agriculture is similar to other parts of the county. However, it's well known that there are huge differences, and if you could pull up page 6 of SDWA 264, table 1 there illustrates some of these differences. So page 6, there it is. So this table was compiled from data in the county crop report and the economic sustainability plan of the Delta, which was RTD 301. These are the 2 main sources that Dr. Thornburg used in his testimony, so this data was available to him from the documents he was reviewing. It shows stark differences that should have been readily apparent between Delta agriculture and San Joaquin County agriculture. So the 2 columns on the far right show acreage estimates for San Joaquin County Delta area in 2009. On the left shows acres in the county as a whole, as well as the total county value, and it just orders those so that the list isn't too long. We picked the 10 most valuable crops in the county in 2009. The Delta, legal Delta share of San Joaquin County is about 30% of the irrigated crop area, but only about 15% of the value because of the differences in what is grown. So you'll see there that the highest revenue crops, grapes, cherries, walnuts, and almonds, are less than 10% of the acreage is in the Delta. These are grown in very limited quantities in the legal Delta, whereas the legal Delta agriculture is dominated by corn and alfalfa. It just looks very different, what is grown between the county as a whole and the legal Delta. You'll see that the crops that are grown, that are not grown much in the Delta, are dominated by salt-sensitive woody crops. They're rarely grown there, and they can struggle when they are grown there. So that's almonds, grapes, walnuts, and cherries. Inside the Delta, we see corn and alfalfa. Now, this data is from 2009. The most recent crop report in 2015, if you may be surprised to see almonds are fifth. Almonds are now number one. You know, like much of the San Joaquin Valley, this has been increasing in acreage. And so in the county as a whole, there's been strong growth in acreage in grapes, walnuts, and almonds since 2009. But there's no evidence that that's grown in the Delta. Second overarching issue is the logical chain Dr. Thornburg referenced repeatedly that says, that he said represented my analysis, but this misrepresents not only my testimony, but the way that farmers make decisions about their crops. He described the sequence as first, salinity changes due to WaterFix or something else. Second, farmers suffer reduced yields and revenue in some crops from the damage. And third, they would then shift to lower value crops. Dr. Thornburg's logic chain, where crop choice is only made after damage is incurred, does not accurately describe the logic in my analysis and testimony, nor does it accurately describe the way farmers make decisions. Crop choice and planting decisions are made far before any salinity damage could be realized. Farmers have a good idea of growing season water quality before they make planting decisions. So this distinction is really important, not only for his criticism of the crop choice model, which is the lead of the analysis and testimony, but it also has implications for his own yield model that I'll discuss in a moment. So now let me turn to the models. First, I'm going to discuss this crop choice model. It was utilized by myself as well as Dr. Sunding in reports for the DPC and the Department of Water Resources. In my view, this is by far the most important of the three agricultural economic models that are discussed in my testimony and SIR rebuttal, as well as Dr. Thornburg's rebuttal. This is because it utilizes a great deal of Delta-specific data. It's been peer-reviewed, and it was developed by reputable experts in reports for both the petitioners and the protestants in this proceeding. The content of Dr. Thornburg's criticism of the data and the model, unfortunately, requires me to review its origins a bit in these two published reports because he created a lot of confusion about these issues. So the original origin of the model is in 2011 when I was working on the DPC Economic Sustainability Plan. I hired Dr. Sunding, an agricultural economist from UC Berkeley, to help me in developing the analysis of Delta agriculture. The crop choice model was based on some previous work that he had done for the Sacramento County of Governments in Yolo and Sacramento County related to their urban-rural connection strategy, not related to the Delta, but he had actually started using this model and had put together a data set for Yolo and Sacramento County. So we extended that data set to the legal Delta and applied the model to the issues of Delta agriculture. The data was compiled by analysts working under him. The report was positively peer-reviewed in late 2011 by an expert panel assembled by the Delta Independent Science Board. It was finalized in early 2012. In 2013, in August 2013, the same model was used independent of me in the Bay Delta Conservation Plan's statewide economic impact report, a report Dr. Sunding and ICF prepared for the Department of Water Resources. It was released with a news release and a press call to promote the tunnels. My testimony primarily cited the 2013 Department of Water Resources report and used its estimate of crop damage rather than the Delta Protection Commission report. And there's a reason for that. If you look at, actually, if you can pull up my testimony, page 9, lines 3 through 7. I have a quote there. This is a quote from the DWR report, and why I cited it as my primary reference. It says the modeling methodology is consistent with that employed in the Economic Sustainability Plan. Moving on, the model is implemented as outlined in the ESP, with the exception of the incorporation of estimated salinity data from DSM-2. Now, I use the DWR report as my primary reference because it closely followed the structure of this petition. It used DSM-2 predictions of salinity changes and incorporated those into the model to make a prediction. Since the model and the findings are in a previous petitioner's report from their consulting economists, implemented in a way consistent with this petition, I assumed its findings were broadly accepted and non-controversial. Dr. Thornburg's rebuttal testimony only includes references to the first report, the Economic Sustainability Plan, RTD 301 and 305, an appendix of it, not the DWR report that was my primary reference for damage estimates. Dr. Thornburg stated under cross-examination that he had not personally read either one of these reports, which largely explains why his criticism of the model is inaccurate and misinformed. For example, at one point, Dr. Thornburg claims my analysis is not credible because I supposedly deleted 2005 data from the model to produce a desired result. This is a serious accusation of research misconduct. If true, there could be sufficient grounds for my termination from my job, as well as disqualification of an expert witness. Now, fortunately, Dr. Thornburg's criticism is baseless and easily proven false with information readily available to him. First of all, I'll point out that DWR's 2013 BDCP statewide economic impact report that I just discussed includes the same clear statement about the 2005 data as the 2011 DPC report. The direct references in my written testimony. That means that Dr. Sunding omitted the same data in his analysis done for DWR in a report promoting the tunnels, a fact that Dr. Thornburg should have noticed since my testimony, as I've stated, took its damage estimate from the DWR report. If I had intentionally removed the 2005 data from the DPC report to skew the analysis against the tunnels, Dr. Sunding would have put the data back into the report 18 months later in the report for the petitioners. So that should have raised a question in the eyes of Dr. Thornburg. If Dr. Thornburg or even DWR's counsel had simply asked their consultant, Dr. Sunding, why the data was not in his report, they would have learned that the decision to exclude 2005 data was made by him and his analysts and not by me. Finally, if this year's data is an intentional act to bias the results, the standard would have been to obtain the model, incorporate the missing data, and show how it affects the results. Dr. Thornburg failed to do this, even though DWR has the data in the model. As I mentioned, has been used by their consultants. Dr. Thornburg's other criticism of the crop choice model is similarly misinformed. There's more details in my written testimony. One example of this is him saying the crop choice data set is too thin for the model, ignoring that it contains over 6,000 field level observations. In contrast, he puts great stock in his regressions, which are based on 26 data points from the county crop report. And that's my next topic, is Dr. Thornburg's empirical yield model. Dr. Thornburg's rebuttal centers on new data analysis specifically prepared for his rebuttal testimony, has not been peer-reviewed or presented in any other form. His approach is to use the aggregate annual countywide yield estimates for individual crops and correlate them to water quality in a specific part of the South Delta. I've already discussed the vast differences between Delta agriculture and overall San Joaquin County, the vast majority of which is not irrigated with water diverted from the Delta. Thus, the use of aggregate countywide data is obviously invalid. However, we can go beyond that, because if Dr. Thornburg's approach of a simple time series regressions on aggregate data would be invalid even if he did have Delta-specific yield data. For example, somebody might argue, well, maybe the corn regression's valid because most of corn grown in San Joaquin County is grown in the Delta. So thus, I'm going to briefly explain why his analysis is invalid even if he had that data. First, if you pull up DWR 84, page 23, and we can take a look at the table and how he defined the salinity variable. So right there, lines 19 to 20. The top variable of interest, well, how did he define salinity? You'll see that it's the annual average, and this is the covariate of primary interest. And here's the key part, it's the average of the current and previous year to take into account the additive impact of salt. So he's not even using current year salinity, he's combining it with the previous year to mask the effects of current year salinity. This is invalid. If you wanted to look at previous year salinity and see if it had an effect, you would include it as separate variables. Second, Dr. Thornburg's model does not control for strong and well-known positive trend in crop yields over time. For example, corn yields in the U.S. at the beginning of his period in 1990 averaged 120 bushels an acre. In recent years, they've averaged 175 bushels an acre, about a 50% increase in corn yields. This is especially important since, as he states, there's a clear increasing trend in delta salinity over the same period. Thus, his positive effects of salinity on yields are just spurious correlation due to a failure to control for this technological growth that's increased yields. He could have controlled for it with several simple, well-known empirical approaches, but he did not. Third, Dr. Thornburg's model does not account for additional costs farmers incur trying to reduce the effect of salinity on their crop yields. Those efforts might keep those crop yields up even though there's an impact. And fourth, the model has a sample selection bias problem because it doesn't control for the decision not to plant crops in years when salinity is expected to be high. These are the primary flaws. There's additional ones discussed in my written testimony. The last 2 points in my testimony about the delta-specific theoretical yield model. This section is based on calculations of yield loss and the leaching fractions that we've been hearing other experts talk about, so I'll be very brief since it's been covered thoroughly by others. I'll just point out that Dr. Thornburg criticized this section for being theoretical rather than empirical, but it could not be empirical because there is no delta-specific data on yields. Second, Dr. Thornburg criticized my calculations for using non-representative crops, but to Dr. Thornburg's credit, he did acknowledge in cross-examination that this was an overstatement after he admitted he didn't know which crops are most common in the Delta. The final point is about flood risk and non-agricultural economic impacts. Delta tunnel discussions often focus on the risk of a catastrophic flood. Since the economic consequences of such a flood on San Joaquin County would be so large, in fact, the losses would be greater than those due to disrupted water exports to the rest of the state, it's critically important to ensure that building the tunnels would not increase flood risk in the Delta. Dr. Thornburg misrepresented my testimony by stating that I argued paying for the WaterFix would take money away from Delta levies. However, my argument had nothing to do with what WaterFix costs or how it's paid for. It made two simple arguments. One was about levy funding policy moving to a beneficiary pays system, which is from the governor's water plan to various Delta plans, the clear direction of policy. The presence of such a system would, the tunnels in such a system would result in lower benefits and lower payments made by the water contractors to support Delta levies. So it depends on the presence of the WaterFix, but not how it's paid for. Second, I showed evidence that in their campaign for the tunnels, even in technical reports, petitioners have provided inaccurate information about the benefits and options of investing in levies to key funding and policy-making entities such as the California legislature. Finally, Dr. Thornburg misrepresented my testimony on the potential effects of WaterFix on the transportation of people and goods between San Joaquin County and the Bay Area. This is because he focused on the impacts during the construction period and focused on the impacts on a single industry, logistics. Instead, the more important point about Delta flood risk and the damage to the transportation system and the enormous economic loss across the entire Delta economy if such a flood were to disrupt or destroy key transportation corridors as predicted in various reports. So in conclusion, Dr. Thornburg's rebuttal is a series of inaccurate facts, misrepresentations, and invalid analysis. It should be disregarded in its entirety, in my view. The evidence is clear that the WaterFix will have negative economic effects on water users in the Delta. Thank you.
Dr. Michael is now available for cross-examination.
All right, thank you. I think at this time we'll take a 10-minute break, short break. Is that all right with you, Candace? Because I believe we will wrap up after this cross-examination. So we will return at 11 o'clock. All right, it's 11 o'clock. We are back in session. Mr. Mizell, Ms. McGinnis. Please remind me again, how much time do you anticipate needing for this cross-examination?
I believe yesterday we estimated 30 minutes, and I believe I can shorten that to no more than 15.
Oh, okay. Efficiency is always appreciated.
My topics are going to be the use of the leaching fractions in Dr. Michael's testimony, as well as revisiting a statement he just clarified on verbal with regard to levy funding. Mr. Hunt, if we could bring up SDWA 264, please. And go to page 17. If we could scroll down so that the paragraph for lines 12 through the end, yeah, perfect. So on lines 17 to 18, you make a point in your testimony that determining the leaching fraction of land in the delta is important in order for you to calculate your assumed yield losses, correct?
Correct, yeah.
And you focus in particularly on low leaching fractions, is that correct?
Yeah, we had to make an estimate of the share of land that has low leaching fractions.
Perfect, thank you. And you acknowledge that Dr. Leinfelder-Miles' study was not sufficient to establish the distribution of low leaching fractions in the delta, is that correct?
I don't believe there's any study that's sufficient to establish that distribution, including Dr. Leinfelder-Miles. Yeah.
Thank you. But your calculation of financial injury relies upon Dr. Leinfelder-Miles' leaching fraction of 5%, is that correct?
In that calculation, if you'll see, there's a sentence there that says if only 30% of the sample had leaching fractions, then yeah, the calculations would be different. So I wouldn't focus on the specific dollar value, because there's a lot of uncertainty underneath those. And that's part of the reason why I put greater weight in the crop choice model than in this model, because it is an empirical model that's based on a very large and representative data set of the delta.
That's all very helpful. I wasn't necessarily thinking that you answered the specifics of my question, though. Was the 5% based upon Dr. Leinfelder-Miles' study?
Well, the 5% was based on the leaching fractions, the tables I received from Dr. Pritchard, and then assuming that about 50% of the acreage in the San Joaquin County share of the delta was based on Dr. Leinfelder-Miles' study, yes.
Okay, and I believe we established in previous cross-examination that Dr. Pritchard relied upon Dr. Leinfelder-Miles. Mr. Pritchard relied upon Dr. Leinfelder-Miles. Is that your recollection?
I can't speak to what Dr. Pritchard relied upon.
Very good, I'll move on. But what you did rely upon from Dr. Leinfelder-Miles, if I understand your previous answer, is the 50% number?
Yes.
Okay. So you relied upon her insufficient study to apply the results to 50% of the lands in the delta. Is that correct?
I hear an
Stick to the
objection.
characterization.
Sustain.
I'll use his exact words then. So you rely upon a study which you characterize as not sufficient to apply your results to 50% of the lands in the delta. Is that correct?
I applied what I viewed as the best available and most current data on leaching fractions in the delta. However, a comprehensive study of leaching fractions at hundreds of sites within the delta would be preferred, but does not exist, to my knowledge.
So the percentage of lands in the delta with low leaching fractions could be less than 50%.
Yes.
Mr. Hunt, if we could bring up DWR 580, please. And so for reference, this is the 2010 Hoffman report. This is also listed as SWRCB Exhibit 101, I believe. Are you aware, Dr. Michael, of what leaching fractions were used by Dr. Hoffman?
It's been a while since I've read this report, but so as I recall, it's a lengthy report, which with many tables with leaching fractions in them. So could you be more specific?
No, I think whether or not you recall them, that's fine. I agree. It is a lengthy report. It's very hard to recall all the numbers in it. So I'll move on. I think that's probably not worth exploring anymore. When you read the Hoffman report, did you read his responses to questions and comments submitted from the South Delta Water Agency, who I believe is who is employing you for this hearing?
This goes beyond the scope of Sir rebuttal, and I would object on that basis.
Mr. Mizell?
Certainly. Dr. Michael critiques the Hoffman report in his Sir rebuttal testimony. He also critiques Dr. Thornburg for not having extensive review of the materials indicating salinity and crop relationships in the delta. Therefore, I think it's a fair question to ask if he is aware of the salinity studies and crop studies in the delta, since that was a critique he leveled at Dr. Thornburg.
Hold on. Dr. Michael? Dr. Michael, did you wish to clarify something?
Oh, just to say I've read the report.
All right. I'll allow you to ask your question, but obviously Dr. Michael will only answer to the extent that he can.
Perfect. So I'll just repeat the question. When you read the Hoffman report, did you read his responses to the questions and comments filed by the South Delta Water Agency?
I don't recall that. I've read this report the first time several years ago, and most recently in the past 6 months. I don't recall if I read those questions.
Okay. Are you aware that Dr. Hoffman cites to and relies upon Myers et al. For some of his conclusions?
I do remember that, yes.
Are you aware that Myers et al. Sampled multiple locations in the delta?
Yes, I am aware of that.
Thank you. And that Myers et al. Used a range of crops grown in the delta with a range of salinity tolerances? Are you aware of that?
I don't remember that level of detail, no.
I'd like to go to a statement that you just recently made on your verbal summary, because I think it was trying to clarify some of your previous testimony, and I'd like to be sure that I'm not misunderstanding you. Did you indicate today that your case-in-chief and rebuttal testimony on levy funding is not related to how or who pays for the California WaterFix?
The The two main arguments that I made that I referred to is not related. Now, if you recall, that case-in-chief testimony was about 20 pages long, and 10 pages of it was stricken, which was about financial feasibility and who paid for the WaterFix. So it is possible that the discussion of levy funding, there may have also been a statement that slipped in there. I have a feeling I'm about to find out.
Yes, thank you. We would move to strike any testimony related to levy funding. As the witnesses just indicated, it's not relevant to the California WaterFix, but instead seeks to explain other processes beyond the California WaterFix and how they may or may not fund levies in the future. And if it is clearer, I can certainly file that in writing.
Are you, let me make sure I understand, you're moving to strike the verbal portion of his testimony today that referred to this issue?
No, I would be moving to strike any remaining testimony in his case-in-chief or rebuttal testimony based upon the clarification of that work that it is not related, and those are the witness's words, to who and how pays for the California WaterFix. And therefore, it's beyond the scope of this hearing.
Now I'm confused. Dr. Michael, explain to me again what you meant.
Related to the presence of WaterFix and whether or not it's been built and information that's been provided during the process of planning and promoting the WaterFix, but the arguments don't depend critically on
Who
how
funds
it's funded. Yes.
So you're not saying that it's not relevant to the petition that is before us?
That's not what I said, no.
I withdraw my objection.
Thank you.
That concludes my cross-examination. Thank you.
Any other cross-examination? Any redirect?
I just have one question on redirect. Dr. Michael, just so it's clear, how did you use could you further explain the relationship between your use of a 50% estimate of land in the South Delta that has a leaching fraction below 5% and how that correlates with Dr. Leinfelder-Miles' study?
Sure. I received the information. I asked for what is the best available data on leaching fractions in the Delta. I was given Dr. Leinfelder-Miles' study as the most recent effort to measure leaching fractions in the Delta. And her data indicated a median around 5%, several sites below 5%. So that was the basis assumption that 50% of the acres could have a 5% leaching fraction.
And that's because 50% or so of the sites that she studied had that level of leaching fraction.
That level or below. I didn't assume any below 5%.
Thank you.
Any recross?
One question, please. So in your answer just now, you indicated that when you asked for the best available science, you were given Dr. Leinfelder-Miles' study as the best available information. Who gave you that information?
Mr. Pritchard did. And I may have said most recent data. I don't recall from exactly how I worded that.
So you either asked for the best available information or you asked for the most recent information. You don't
Probably
recall
both.
which.
I don't recall which. May have asked for both, but Mr. Pritchard showed me her study.
Thank you very much. No questions.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Michael. Mr. Ruiz, at this time, I believe Group 21 is done with your SWR rebuttal. Do you wish to move your exhibits that were used in SWR rebuttal?
Yes, I do. At this time, I would request to have moved in STWA 261, 262, and 263, and 264 as our SIR rebuttal and joint SIR rebuttal exhibits.
And without any outstanding objection, those exhibits are accepted into the record.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think that concludes our portion of today. As a matter of planning purposes, our next time, our next reconvening, I guess, is on July 11th in, Byron Share. In Byron Share. And we will expect to hear from Mr. Brett, Mr. Frink for Group 24, Ms. Deidre Dan, 37, Ms. Seward, 41, and Ms. Womack, 43. All those parties should be prepared to go on Tuesday, the 11th.
Yeah. For clarification, Dr. Michael's testimony was also on behalf of the San Joaquin County Protestants, Group 24. We will also be presenting Dr. Brett and Mr. Frink. And I'm correct, I hope, in understanding that we need not submit anything under our name until that entire Group 24 panel.
That's correct.
Thank you.
And the same goes for Ms. Meserve.
Right, for the land, Group 19, right.
All right. With that, have a good 4th of July, everyone, and I'll see you on the 11th.